That's where we have to take our stand, because that's where the impact is felt. Think of your own children or grandchildren or nieces or nephews.
Welcome back to another episode of Mic'd Up. I'm your host, David Gordon, and today we're going to be talking about the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution is the fell blitzkrieg against Christian chastity that crescendoed in the 1960s and 1970s, and it's itself been far more destructive than all of the wars in all of human history. On a purely corporeal level, the sexual revolution has resulted in 73 million abortions, translation infanticides, per year worldwide. Countless scores of children have had to endure the cross of a life without a father, a birthright which they've been shamefully deprived of. Destitution, criminality, despair, and rudderlessness have followed closely on the heels of illegitimacy for too many. And on the supernatural end of the spectrum, souls are pouring like snowflakes into hell due to sins of the flesh, which many, swept away by the reckless propaganda of godless Western society, have forgotten are gravely offensive to God, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. As intolerable as the physical casualties have been, the spiritual casualties of the sexual revolution are all the more devastating as they translate to children of God being lost forever to perdition. Today, to talk about all this, we're joined by Bishop Peter Elliott, retired auxiliary of the Archdiocese of Melbourne, Australia. Bishop Elliott recently published a book through Ignatius Press decrying the sexual deviancy beguiling the world. The book's titled The Sexual Revolution: History, Ideology, and Power. Your Excellency, thank you for coming on the program today. I'm honored to speak with you.
And I'm honored to be on the program. Thank you.
So, Bishop, just getting right into it, what made you decide to sit down and pen a book on this topic today? You know, writing a book's no mean feat, and it takes some doing. So what really gave you impetus to sit down and dedicate yourself to this topic?
It came out of my experience of studying at the John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family in Rome, doing a doctorate there. But then it moved because later on I went into the Roman Curia and worked in the Pontifical Council for the Family. And we were dealing again and again, almost every day, with questions about the victims of the sexual revolution. And I'm glad you started with the casualties. Then when I came back to Australia after 10 years of Vatican service, I became director of the Melbourne branch of the John Paul Institute, now sadly closed, and I joined in lectures in one subject for teachers actually on sexual education in a Catholic sense of children and young people. And the lectures I gave were about the sexual revolution and the magisterium's response. And then I thought later, why not make this a book? Why not give these lectures material, essentials to everybody? So that expanded out into this book.
I see. So what is the sexual revolution? You know, we hear the term frequently just bandied about, but very few, it's seldom that we hear somebody sit down and really define it in any kind of, definite way.
It's a socio-political movement that emerged 300 years ago. It's not new. It might have peaked, apparently, in the 1960s in this past century, the 20th century, but in fact, you can see the beginning of it with the Western decadence that followed the Reformation, post-Reformation, counter-Reformation era, and places like Versailles in France, and the terrible low morality of the king himself, Louis XIV, and the ruling group, the elite class. And that sort of sinking of morality, a post-Christian morality, was the trigger. And then the real critical moment was the French Revolution. And if you look into the revolution and see how anti-God it was, being anti-God, it was anti-Christian morality. For example, they introduced civil marriage and loosened up things, and they anticipated LGBTIQ by 200-something years. So you've got those facts. And then the next century, you have various thinkers and writers, like Malthus on population, although he was innocent man. And then you have the more open arguments from the libertarians, John Mill, etc. And then along comes Darwin, and he's a key figure. He would be horrified to be told that because he was a moral man. But if you say human beings are just clever monkeys, well, then that's evolving. And I love that word. And that means our morality can evolve, can it not? That's when in the mid-19th century the questions began to flash, particularly about sexual morality. You go on and on into the late 19th century, the emergence of radical left, emergence of communism, and the same moral looseness is coming into play. The big moves happen, of course, in the 20th century. We have people like Margaret Sanger in your country and Murray Stopes in England with the birth control, artificial birth control. But along comes abortion. So I'm so pleased you mentioned abortion first. Without abortion, there can be no current sexual revolution.
Sure, absolutely. Let me pause here for a second, because you said something really interesting. And I don't want to take any liberties with your words, but it sounds like you're kind of putting the onus for this, for the sexual revolution, maybe on just Enlightenment principles in general. Is it fair to say that the Enlightenment itself was the root cause of the sexual revolution? And I mean it like this. An efficient cause is what gives something purpose, and it's what, creates kind of the boundaries by which that thing operates. And if we deny God as efficient cause, and we say nature is, or that, man, we had this existentialist view of man as he kind of makes himself into what he wills himself to be, then we can make our own morality. So is this all just an offshoot of the Enlightenment?
The Enlightenment's an ambiguous movement. On the one hand, you have the quest and struggle for democracy, liberty, particularly in the United States. The other hand, you have the dark side of the Enlightenment, which is moral permissiveness as human liberation, as the Marxists would later put it. And that is certainly the obvious efficient cause of the sexual revolution. So the Enlightenment in its dark side, it's ambiguous, as I've said, is a major causal factor in the whole process.
Yeah, kind of a root from which the whole thing can grow, or at least, providing fertile soil. Tell me about some of and you mentioned a few, up to and including Margaret Sanger, but who would you say are the biggest villains in bringing about the sexual revolution? Who really gave it teeth or gave it wheels?
Well, it's hard to say any one particular person. You have groups of people. The sexologists, largely from Germany in the late 19th century, decided to analyze sex. That was their role, in a scientific way, which of course was the rage at the time. And they treated human beings and human behavior as something you observed. That runs on into the modern sexologists in the United States and elsewhere. And they see it as sort of specimens. We're specimens. So while they seem to be morally neutral, to be scientific, in fact, they're not. They're saying that we human beings are really reacting, responding animals, and our behavior just needs to be analyzed. And that's opened the gateway to all sorts of bad things, and from our Christian point of view.
Now, is the sexual revolution still something that's unfolding before our eyes today? A lot of people have it in this sort of time capsule of the 60s or 70s, or even back, turn of the century, the Margaret Sanger era. But is it still unfolding before our eyes today?
Oh, yes. In fact, it's more powerful than ever. But that's also its weakness. I could deal with that later. But it apparently peaked in the 60s. It came out on the streets. The flower power, the drugs are an important factor. The gay liberation movement, radical feminism, there's a whole string of factors there in the 60s and 70s. But now it's consolidated and become institutionalized. Now, when a revolution has gained power, or think it's gained power, because it hasn't completely gained power at all, it becomes an institution, and along can come another revolution and push it over. One of the main factors that in that process in recent years, in the last 4 or 5 or 6 decades, is the rise of neo-Marxism, which comes from the 1930s, from the heretical communist, to put him that way, Antonio Gramsci in Italy. And he said, we're not going to win the war of the classes and all that stuff if we have revolutions on the streets, because nobody's interested in that much anymore. They're coming out of the Depression, they're getting work, etc., etc. He said, we must penetrate the institutions and undermine them from within, gradually. Later, this was called the Long March Through the Institutions. So you take the neo-Marxist ideology and you run it into trade unions, universities, schools, churches, local clubs. You push it and it goes all over the place, gradually gnawing away at what's good in those institutions or structures in our contemporary society. And that's where we are now. And that's why you have some areas of the mass media committed to the sexual revolution, but others not, because this sets up a reaction. And we are part of that reaction. I don't think we're reactionary. I don't like that term. And that's stuck on us, as again, looking at a Marxist label. We are reacting in a positive way. What wonderful news from the USA, the repeal of Roe versus Wade, and suddenly we see the repressed anti-abortion movement coming to the surface, and you have legislation in various states to restrict, limit, or try to eliminate abortion. Now, I remember when I was a young priest 50 years ago, and I was ordained 50 years ago, we were right in the fight then, certainly in my country, 73. We had our own equivalent of Roe versus Wade that year. It was all different. Now that's changing now. No longer is the trendy, fashionable push to be pro-abortion. Of course, there are various factors from big corporations and wealthy trusts like Soros, Rockefeller, and those that have always been committed to population control, just something we watched very carefully from the Vatican in my time. But also we have here, the money is not going to do everything. You can be loaded with billions of dollars and think you're doing the work of the sexual revolution. But where will it get you? In the end, things come back to the small people, those of us who are speaking with the light of Christ and the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, truth is inherently attractive. You know, the other side, they have to dress up their lies and make them attractive to people and bury the truth so that they can accomplish their agenda. But the beauty of sharing the truth of Christ is that it in and of itself attracts. Now, you said this about Antonio Gramsci and the neo-Marxists, and I wanted to press you on that. What is the connection between guys like Gramsci and Marxism and the sexual revolution? How are those things connected? You know, if you study classical Marxism, it's very economical. It's this materialistic dialectic that we see playing out really between with a class struggle. How, with thinkers like Gramsci, do we now have a connection between sex and family life and ushering in a revolution to overthrow the bourgeoisie?
Well, it's a different scenario that Gramsci established, because he was regarded by Moscow and Stalin as a heretic, and his communism was very different because it wanted to use the institutions and not destroy them outright, because he knew you couldn't do that. And so that's why I call it neo-Marxism. And it's come from him. In himself, he was a moral man. He wasn't into permissiveness. And that's the strange factor. Many of the early communists were very puritanical. I know that because I have communist relatives, and they've told me a lot about how the party would even decide who you married. And there was no permissive approach to relations. But that may have lingered in the Soviet system. But now we have the situation where a kind of neo-Marxism is spreading, which re-identifies the human person. And earlier on, you touched on that. The identity politics of today is so destructive, rests on a false understanding of the human person. I make myself. I am my self-creator. There is no God, or if there is a God, that God's not interested in us. I make myself because I'm basically a body and a mind. And the body, I can do what I like with the body, as long as the mind's okay, or the mind approves of it. And he'll have the identity of, okay, I've got a woman's body, but I want to become a man. I choose that. That's my new identity. So I'll take steps to become a man. And that's where we enter the more recent movement of transsexualism based on sexual dysphoria.
I would take that back to the Enlightenment, like I was saying, with this idea that existence precedes essence, this existentialist idea that one can make of himself what he wants. And I think I see it that at the root of that, at the heart of that, at the nucleus of that, a rejection of an efficient cause.
It's a rejection of God. There's a creator God. And it's a rejection of the human nature. There's no such thing as human nature. And therefore, I've got a chapter in my book on this, these things that push forward the revolution today. And yet, it's very vulnerable. And that's why we need to fall back on that beautiful virtue that we always forget, hope. Hope eternal.
Well said. Well said. Let me ask, there was, and there seemingly always has been, a connection between Marxism, neo-Marxism, and the sexual revolution. You know, even going back to Marx himself, he said, no, and I'm paraphrasing here, but no revolution can take place without the feminine ferment. And obviously, when the Bolsheviks swept into power in the Soviet Union, one of the first targets they had was the traditional family, which they saw as a locus of patriarchy and subjugation. So they ushered in no-fault divorce, which was a model for California's law in the 50s and 60s here stateside. So it seems like, for whatever reason, Marxists have always understood that in order to accomplish their agenda, then they have to be proponents of the sexual revolution in certain forms. And I'm not saying that all of the sexual revolution comes from Marxism, as you just parsed out for us. There's, you know, the cause, it goes back a long, long way, even preceding Marx. This is kind of a parallel evolution, it would seem. But there does seem to be this Marxist fixation and pushing and cheerleading for the sexual revolution. What is that, good Bishop?
I would say a lot of it is calculated and quite callous. It's not a real commitment. It's using sexual permissiveness as an instrument to break down particularly the big targets, the family and young people. And when the late Cardinal Carlo Caffarra, who was my boss in Rome when I studied, wonderful Cardinal of Bologna, great man, he had a private interview with Sister Lucia of Fatima. And she told him the ultimate battle will be in the family. And that's where we have to take our stand, because that's where the impact is felt. Think of your own children or grandchildren or nieces or nephews. They can get pornography, and there's another big stream in the revolution. is pornography along with abortion. They can pick pornography up simply by looking at their phone. There it is, a cell phone, and variations these days of technology. A little 8-year-old or 6-year-old or 5-year-old can see absolutely degrading and disgusting pornography. And a lot of it involves violence, and most of it's anti-woman, because one of the features of the sexual revolution is the degradation of women, and women become victims. Think of no-fault divorce. Who's left on the hill alone? The woman. You think of all the sorts of relationships. People say, this is my partner. They don't say, this is my wife, because they want to get rid of her when they choose. They'll move on, and she's left. Again and again, the feminists need to be persuaded, hey, the sexual revolution's not gone in your favour. And then you have an area of women's exploited by prostitution, which is another major factor, because it's been reworked with the game of language and identity. Prostitutes are now called sex workers. Okay, we must smile about that, because the language game is very important, as we've learnt from Lenin and Goebbels. But what does that mean? It means that not just poor women will go into prostitution, which has been a problem right across human history, but prosperous middle-class woman, she'll say, I want another job, I need to be doing, I'll go on the game, and that's what's happening. And that is the collapse of sexual morality, often within a family circle. And that is one of the most terrible aspects of women being destroyed by the sexual revolution.
You see it now. You see it with OnlyFans accounts. And I don't know if you've been following some of those news stories, but obviously that's a big trending topic if you're on Catholic Twitter, Catholic social media. There is a glut of OnlyFans accounts for young women now who have discovered, yes, they can absolutely make huge money essentially selling themselves, making a piece of meat of themselves to male patrons.
And then you go back to that principle earlier. My body is like an instrument. It's something I adapt and use and choose, whether it's a sexual role or a gender so-called role. But as long as my mind is in control. And that's the split between mind and body. You don't find that in St. Thomas Aquinas, the classical Catholic philosophy of the unity of the human person, proclaimed by the modern popes very clearly, because they can see that a lot of the struggle is about the human person. God on the one hand, yes, the other hand is, who am I? And when you start to give the wrong answers to that, that's when things fall apart and the immorality starts to sweep in.
So did the neo-Marxists and Marxists target the family specifically with the sexual revolution because they're smart and they understand that the family is what the church calls the first and vital cell of society? Was it this idea of kind of, I believe you refer to it in the book as entryism, or kind of co-opting an institution to your own ends, kind of deforming, if you can apply this entryism to the family, or a long march through the institutions to the family? Was that their plan?
When you say plan and conspiracy, I think it's obvious. It's not a conspiracy because you can identify it and measure it. I think it came from the debate among Marxists how best to take control of society. And they discovered that the sexual element, particularly after the Second War, was going to be the useful instrument. I don't say they're committed to it. This is the paradox of evil, that it can use something that officially it may disdain, like I told you, old communists were Puritans, and yet unofficially and in fact practically they will endorse and use. Again, it's the instrumentalization of human sexuality and the exploitation of people. See, one of the features in my book that I really emphasize is, let's look at these people not as our opponents and enemies, but as victims. And that's that. And once you get that, you see the church's policy in all her modern documents on human sexuality, whatever the Pope is, it consistently says, these are our principles, this is the Ten Commandments, morality, natural law, etc., humani vitae, evangelium, and all that. But when it comes to practice, we have to be pastoral. That's risky because it sends signals that get confused, especially in the media, which is out to confuse people on anything Catholic. Right. But it's the only Christian approach to pick up the victims. See, I argue that LGBTIQ, whatever, etc., it's the people in that are already victims. They can't see that. And they can't see the tactical mistake that they've made is the very thing they seek to get rid of, homophobia, transphobia, they increase it by their activism. And that's one of the weaknesses of the new elements in the sexual revolution. They're too active, they're too obvious, and they're aggressive, and they are triumphalist. And that is the devil's recipe, but it leads to collapse.
Yeah, I want to get into that in the latter part of the interview, is exactly how do we battle this going forward. And I think you have some good ideas. There are a lot of people who understand that the sexual revolution is off the tracks, off the rails, but there's not a lot of great ideas for actually how to restore order to society. So I do want to pick your brain on that. Just going back to this kind of attack on the family, why do the people who are the fomenters of the sexual revolution want to attack the family? What do they gain from it?
They gain the division of the family into individuals, and individuals going their own way. We hear that, don't we? Our daughter's going her own way, and it usually means she's a wayward girl. It splits the family. The cohesion of the basic unit of society, as the church teaches, the organic unit, the living self, is broken up. And then you have the atomization, as they call it, of society, into individuals. And it's easy to manipulate individuals. But if you have little communities saying, hey, we don't want this stuff, whether it's Marxist propaganda or whatever, wherever it comes on politically or socially, we want to keep this out of our homes. That's when there's a real war on, and that's why what Lucia of Fatima said is so true. The last battles will be in the family.
Is that why at Fatima the Blessed Virgin warned that the Soviet Union, Russia, would spread her errors around the world? Was she talking, was Our Lady speaking about the sexual revolution in particular, or more of a communism writ large?
I think she was talking about communism writ large at the time, because the last apparitions coincide with the Russian Revolution, 1917, which is very interesting. And I've just been watching this new film on Fatima, which, with a few flaws, is very well presented, and even gives the vision of hell that the children had. So you're looking at the salvation of souls, that what comes in. And that's why the message of Fatima is about souls, the salvation of souls. And the errors spread by communism destroy souls. Now, the mind of the Blessed Mother is not open to us entirely. We know what she said as a messenger of Jesus Christ. But I would say that implicitly, the sexual revolution and the attack on the family is certainly there in the apparitions.
Really? Okay, yeah. I mean, do the visions ever explain how this is going to come to pass? It sounds like you, and through your mentor, you've spoken, or your mentor spoke to Sister Lucia herself. Does she ever explain how all this is going to come to pass? How this agenda was going to kind of play out on the world stage in the years after the apparitions at Fatima?
I don't think we know. And there are many things about Fatima, particularly the events afterwards, that we know. But one word is used for fashions, bad fashions. Now, in Southern Europe, in the Catholic countries of Spain and Italy, and that bad fashions is a euphemism for immorality spreading, being copied by young people in particular, or people who want to big note themselves. And that is a reference to immorality. Yeah.
Sure. How has the sexual revolution affected even the granular parts of Western society, like language, grammar, fashion you just mentioned? How has it really infiltrated and permeated every aspect of Western society?
Well, in the language game, you see, you don't talk about husbands or wives now, you talk about partners. My late mother was a very witty woman. She was half German, but not a dour one. And she said to people, they'd come and meet her at drinks or something, and the man would say, "This is my partner." My mother would say, "Oh, you're in business together, aren't you?" She just turned it round. And but it's a very cunning word, because the words husband and wife, that's a language game, are pushed aside. And there's a whole lot of other words that we accept. Marriage, matrimony, these are pushed aside, or totally redefined, as in same-sex marriage. They don't say same-sex matrimony, because matrimony is all about making a woman a mater, a mother from the Latin. A lot of our language about human relations comes from ancient Rome and Greece and that, and it's quite specific. And that has to be dumped. So you have a new range of words. That's the word game. And as Lenin said, speak my words and think my thoughts. Now, he meant the ideology, but later on, that's something that is so true in the world today. And the media pump new words into us. And the words slide around and then exclude the traditional language. And that's the language game. Granular, breaking up society, breaking up areas of language and behaviour. And that's why we now have relationships rather than marriages.
Right. So you're kind of seeing that in the hookup culture, obviously, is a major component of the sexual revolution. The idea that you can kind of use a person for your own pleasure. And we see that playing out in colleges, universities. There is this dominant hookup culture. People no longer even court or date, it seems like. It seems like everything has just been overtly sexualized, and the human relationality has been removed from conjugality and human sexuality.
Yes, that is so, particularly through the mass media and the social media. They're the instruments of this change that's happening. But we see in the mass media attempts to introduce the sexual revolution ideology that then collapse, like Disney are in big trouble over an outrageous version of, I think, Snow White, which is being repaired or looked at least. It turns everything upside down. And that is the end of fairy tales. And fairy tales are vectors often for good morality, because the fairy tales that we repeat still to children, they've all got a moral, they're moralistic. And the morals are usually very good. And then we go into the dark zone of the occult, which is tied up with the sex revolution, where bad becomes good, and where you have the witch is a good figure. And that started in the media with Bewitched and other things, in terms of old television. But the witch is not what we would teach children, and I still teach children, my nieces and nephews. All witches are bad. Let's get rid of this Wicca nonsense. They may be innocent, some of those Wicca people, but they're serving Satan.
That's where the word wicked comes from. That's the etymology of the word wicked, actually. It comes from witchcraft.
Forget that. The etymology of words is something most people just don't pick up. We're dumped with words forced on us by media and by custom, or by groups trying to protect and promote themselves. So the word game is essential. But the granular part comes in. There's another factor I'm going to have to introduce. Okay, Marxism is responsible for much of it in a paradoxical way. You also got big business coming in, super capitalism. There's a lot of money to be made in the contraceptive industry. There's a lot of money to be made in pornography that is illegal or legal, so-called. There's a lot of money to be made in drugs and the attempts to legalize drugs. Very powerful push in my country at the moment about cannabis. These are all pressures coming from people seeking to make themselves rich out of the sexual revolution and the permissiveness generally associated with it. Now, that's coming from a lot of corporations and pressure groups linked to them. And so here we have the capitalist side of the sexual revolution, which in some ways is more effective than the sort of learned Germans sitting in a circle and discussing how they can change the behaviour of people. This is much more effective in our kind of consumerist world.
Do you see that in the Western corporation, how it's really drawn women out of, the shelter of the domestic life in mass, so that they can keep wages down and basically double the workforce and not have to provide as many incentives and perquisites to attract talent? Because if you draw people, twice the number of people into the workforce, then you're guaranteed a steady supply of labor.
Yes, you're quite right. This is one of the... I watch the policies of political parties, left and right, and they've both got that agenda. It's interesting. Get as many women out of the home working. Now, that can be managed, but I think you have to be a very good manager to raise a family and go to work every morning in some office or factory. It's part of the so-called equality, men and women are equal. Well, I believe in equal pay for women, sure. But often these corporations, as you know, don't. They get the cheap workforce by underpaying the women, and the women are being led up the garden path of seeking prosperity. Now, let's be fair, there are many cases where women are forced to work. That's tied up again with the economic problems, which we're all now experience around the world, problems with food and rent and keeping going. And that's the paradox. What was promised us of the prosperous future is just not happening. And that leads to the degradation and exploitation of women.
Sure. And despite even the Second Vatican Council saying Gaudium et Spes 52, the place at home must be carefully preserved for women because children need the care of their mothers. And that seems to be forgotten even in the post-conciliar world. But aside from that, leaving the issue of women's rights for a second, where else do you see the sexual revolution playing out in countries like America, in Australia? Obviously, the domestic battles is one sphere, but where else just in society as a whole?
Well, I would say, going back to a theme I raised in the beginning, the challenging now of abortion is very important because that has other repercussions, as you know. And I think the other area is the collapse of transgenderism. Now, the transgender movement, transsexual, they would not admit this, but they're in big trouble because of the many cases that are coming up legally in the law. Little Miss Jane becomes boy George or whatever, and then she regrets it. And then she tries to retransition. She's told she mustn't do that. That's forbidden. And there's even laws in my country forbidding that. That's how bad it is down here. And then it ends up in court, and her parents sue the clinic that did the surgery, etc. That's why the Tavistock centre in London has had to be closed. And that was the centre of the exploitation, as we put it, of children with the transgender mythology and ideology.
Sure.
So there's some signs of it, but that's a particular area that's current that I would look at and not be too pessimistic about, because evil within itself always carries an inner weakness. And Jesus Christ is the risen Lord, and he's the Lord. And in the end, he triumphs.
So let's talk about that. What are some strategies going forward for combating and reversing, dare I say, the sexual revolution? And you talk about keeping hope on your hearts, but it seems like we are staring at just such an overwhelming monstrosity that has changed the way people think and moralize fundamentally. And it seems like the momentum, it's like a boulder rolling downhill. The sexual revolution just keeps picking up more and more steam and going to more and more absurd places, so that now, as you've mentioned, we have to make believe that men can be women, women can turn into men. How do we roll this back? How do we win this fight?
If you read the first chapters of my book, you could easily adopt that pessimistic attitude. It's all lost. What can we do? The last two chapters, I provide strategies largely developed from my work in Rome, in the Vatican, in the Pontifical Council for the Family, where we encourage family politics, family groups, action groups, a whole pro-life movement in different countries. And if you get into the home, into the family, that's where the battle is being fought. That's where we have to start. In your family, keep the bad stuff out. Supervise your children's use of cell phones and social media. Don't let them mix with bad company. It's often the problem. And every now and again, you're going to find young people who want to come to your home because things are so bad in their home. These are the victims. You have to treat them with kindness, but with prudence. There's many strategies in that area that I suggest. One is associating families, family associations. Okay, in our neighbourhood, in Greenwich, Connecticut, or wherever it is, they're going to open a sex shop, an adult shop so-called, just around the corner from the school and the church and everything. Fight it. Now, at the level of local government, you can do a lot of this quite easily. Fight it, oppose it, pull it out in the open, expose it, etc. And one family can't do that. One person can't do that. An association, a local association of concerned parents, etc., whatever you want to call them, can do that. And these things are very corruptive and evil, but don't think they're going to win always. You have to have that hope that we can do something. Certainly informing our children we can, and ensuring that the schools are not indoctrinating them. That's important. That's a problem we faced back in the 90s when I worked in the Vatican. Even Catholic schools were allowing inappropriate and sleazy sex education programs in. That still has to be tackled and watched very carefully. Vigilance and being informed. But there's a lot of simple local things that anyone can do if they're committed to reversing, turning back. And the main thing is that we have to promote virtue, the positive side. And that's the great answer to all this, the virtues, the commandments, and instructing people in it, forming them in it. And also a bit of humour is useful, because there's some parts of the sexual revolution which are so ridiculous you have to laugh. And teaching the children to laugh at it, not take it too seriously, and teaching that this stuff is silly, even that level is another good step forward in the struggle to reverse the sex revolution.
Sure, use some of their strategies against them. Risus bellum est, laughter is war. And going back to guys like Saul Alinsky, he says kind of mock your opponents because there's no real good way to defend against mockery. So I think that's actually brilliant what you just said.
But I wouldn't use the word mockery. See, that comes from the godless mind of Alinsky and the cruelty written into his ideology. We make gentle fun of, and only in our own circles. We don't come out in public and mock them, because that backfires, and that doesn't work. We make sure that our own young people can see how foolish a lot of the sexual permissiveness and its associated streams is.
Yeah, no, there's definitely wisdom in that. And that combines kind of orthodoxy with a pastoral approach that's going to attract people. So I can definitely see that. What about just the notion of the domestic church and having large families? Because one of the ironies of the sexual revolution, with all of its emphasis on unfettered sexuality, is that many of the people who are taken in by it don't actually procreate. So if good Catholic families do procreate and procreate abundantly and raise their children for the Lord, not just, procreate the actual maximum amount of children they can have and not pay attention to them, but procreate abundantly and bring their children up in the fear of the Lord, won't we win generationally by just kind of having larger families and taking the reins of society through force of numbers?
Gradually, in some Western or so-called developed countries, that could happen because you're seeing the plunge in the birth rate.
1.7 children per couple in many countries.
And replacement is 3 children per couple. That's replacement, and that's all. But now that needs to be dealt with, again, by encouraging people and facilitating people in procreating. And procreation is the beautiful word because you're sharing in the work of the Creator. It's not just reproduction, procreating. And I'm certainly in favor of that because the church is the larger family. And it's a question there of opening the hearts of parents to be generous and also to spread the kingdom of God with more souls. Every time a child is born, there is another member of the kingdom of God who will be born again in baptism and become a member of the mystical body of Christ. And then you have the other factor there that you're doing that for society. A patriotic American will want to have more children. And there are some areas of the state, certain religious groups, that are good examples of that. Catholics used to be, but the contraceptive thing, since people ignore humane vitae, has crept in. And then it's the conforming to what everyone else is doing. We have to break that cycle and open out the view that a big family is a happy family. And usually it is. And these are the messages to develop and get across and make it clear that babies are beautiful. That was a marvelous campaign in France about 25 years ago. The pro-life people put posters up all around France of a beautiful baby looking at you and saying, "Am I a problem?" Just that. And that hit the abortion industry badly because people said, "Hey, that's beautiful. Babies are beautiful. Families are beautiful. They're beautiful communities because they're living the truth of the Creator and Redeemer." And so I'm confident that that's a way forward. And if I'm asked by someone, a married couple, what should we do for Australia? Now, the only thing that props up our population is immigration. I would say, have another baby. And then they say, you're a priest, you're celibate, you don't have children. I said, but I have a lot of spiritual children, and that's what I'm here for, to tell you that this is the way forward. Have another child. Beautiful. Do it for Australia, do it for the US, and do it for poor old Europe.
Right.
Try and do it for Japan where things have collapsed. Yeah.
I'm thinking of like the Uncle Sam posters with him pointing like, I want you to have another kid or two, you know. Final question, Bishop, because we're out of time. And that's this. How do you win a messaging war against the other side who's so well bankrolled? You know, they do have international financiers like George Soros. And for us, it seems like David versus Goliath because we have kind of grassroots, we have word of mouth. And when we do have kind of more conservative or more orthodox institutions, they're kind of content to fight with limp wrists, not really swinging for the fences, but they want to be moderate and they want to be very circumspect in what they say. Meanwhile, you have the other side swinging haymakers at us and doing everything they can to usher in the kingdom of Satan.
I couldn't agree more. This is the problem. You mentioned Soros. You've got to update there. It's now his son, Alexander Soros, who is more extreme than his dad, so and only 37. So we want to watch out on that front. But he's not the only factor. And as I've said earlier, all the money in the world will not make the sexual revolution triumph. If we keep to the gospel, to the Ten Commandments, teach to our children, live it in our own lives, and this is therefore something that's beyond Catholicism, other Christians, and many other Christians of the more orthodox variety, evangelicals, etc., they know this, and they're our friends and allies. We're waking up to that, the new ecumenism of conservative Christianity across the board. And then we go into the other religions, particularly our Jewish brothers and sisters. I know a wonderful rabbi in Melbourne who's foursquare in all the good causes, and I know he's worried because of his community. You've got the penetration of the liberal ideas that are breaking this up. But the Orthodox and conservative Jews are holding the line, and they're aware of it. And it goes over into even Islam. I did some work at the United Nations with a delegation from Iran, of all places. And they privately said, we are very worried about the way Western sexual morality is pumped into our kids from outside. So it's a concern that's not just a Catholic one or a Greek Orthodox one or a Lutheran one. It is something that's right across the board.
Yeah.
And therefore, we have to work in solidarity with other people in a wider ecumenism, if you want to use that word, for the cause of the kingdom of God and the triumph of her Immaculate Heart.
Beautiful words. And that will also give a chance to evangelize as people see that the Catholic Church, when we're working side by side, has the fullness of truth. And it does give you a chance to share the light of the gospel.
That's happening.
Bishop, thank you so much for being on the show today. Everybody, please buy the book, The Sexual Revolution by Bishop Peter Elliott. It is now out stateside from Ignatius Press Publishers. And, you know, great book, great ideas, exploring a very timely topic. I can't say enough to echo the words of Mary at Fatima and Sister Lucia later on, interpreting the Blessed Virgin's words that this will be the final battle. This is the linchpin of all the societal wars, politics, everything. It's downstream ultimately from the family, from the domestic church, from the first and vital cell of society. So please get the book, buy a copy, and we actually will be carrying it in Church Militant's store. Do please kindly support us, not only with your views, but also with your wallets if you have the means, so we can continue to bring you more quality programming like this and more messaging from good, faithful shepherds like Bishop Elliott. Thank you guys for tuning in to another Mic'd Up. God bless you, and we'll see you next week.